Your social context has far more influence over you than you realize, and it has influence on your creativity as well. Sometimes it's good influence and sometimes it's constraining. I'm here today with Dr. Teresa Amabile, an expert in creativity, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Welcome, Teresa.
Thanks so much, Keith. I'm delighted to be here with you.
I've known about your work since, oh my gosh, all the way back in graduate school, and you're a legend to me, and especially because in my own research, I focused on social environment and group dynamics, and you really are a leader in that area to think about creativity not being something that happens in people's brains, but something that happens in a social context. So tell us about that. Does social context always constrain creativity? Is there some way you can make it better? Can it enhance your creativity?
Let me start by saying, Keith, to me, one of the biggest myths about creativity is that it's all about the person, all about the individual. Yes, creativity does happen in a person's brain, but it also happens in a brain within a social context. And there's no way of getting around that. We do find our creativity in our cognitive skills, some of which are inborn, most of which are developed. We do find our creativity in our personality because that does have an influence, as we know. But most people don't realize how strongly their social environment, their work environment on the job, their school environment, if they're a student, their home environment, how much all of that can impact their ability to achieve their creative potential.
A lot of us don't like the idea that, social context might be constraining us or limiting us. We want to be free. We want to be able to have any ideas we want. But from your research, you found that it can actually benefit you, right? Certain kinds of contexts can enhance your creativity.
Yeah, I have been doing creativity research for over 50 years now. And the first several years of that research was experimental research where I was looking at the possibility that certain aspects of the social environment could undermine creativity. So that's what I went in looking for. And boy, did I find it. I found that creativity could be undermined by a social environment, a school or work environment that focused heavily on external evaluation of work, that put people under surveillance while they were working, that had people competing with one another while they were working, that offered some kind of tangible reward for doing some creative activity. We found that that could undermine creativity, and even just focusing on those externals of reward and what are people going to think of me for what I'm doing? How am I going to be evaluating? Just thinking about those externals can undermine the motivational state that's most important for creativity and undermine creativity. But then I had an awakening and I began looking for ways that creativity could be stimulated and supported, facilitated by the work environment, the school environment. And my team and I did make some pretty interesting discoveries there as well.
Right. You've done research in so many different methodologies. I know you've done this experimental research, you've done interviews and observations, and you mentioned motivation there. And that's one of the things I associate with you is this research on, I think you call it extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. So what are those and what's the difference?
That was the research that I started out doing 50 years ago. I was looking to see if factors in the social environment that undermined intrinsic motivation might also undermine creativity because they impacted that form of motivation. So intrinsic motivation is the motivation to do something because you're interested in it, you find it fascinating, personally challenging, or personally interesting in some way. Extrinsic motivation is a motivation that comes more from something outside. It comes from the promise of reward. So you're motivated to achieve that reward, or you're motivated to get that great evaluation, to get the gold star, the good performance review, get that grade in school. Or you're motivated to avoid punishment, perhaps. You're motivated to win a competition or to get recognition. All of those are considered extrinsic motivators. They can absolutely motivate people to do something. But what I found in those early experiments was that each of those things, each of those motivators or constraints can actually undermine intrinsic motivation and, as a result, undermine creativity. Later studies showed that there are some situations in which extrinsic motivation doesn't undermine creativity, but we can talk a little bit more about what those special conditions are. In general, though, my theory, which is based on all of these experiments that I did, says that intrinsic motivation is necessary for people to perform at their highest levels of creativity.
Right. I think it was a counterintuitive finding for a lot of people that extrinsic motivation or external rewards could somehow interfere with creativity because, let's say, you're a manager or you're running a company, you want to reward people for coming up with really good ideas. Or if you're a teacher, you want your students to get A's if they're more creative. But this type of assessment can have that negative effect. But you've also pointed out that certain kinds of extrinsic motivators can still benefit. So how do we know which is which? What kind of factors are going to be the right ones?
The short answer is that anything that leads people to feel controlled or constrained in some way will undermine intrinsic motivation and creativity. And that's a very clear finding, not just from my decades of research, but many other people have found that same effect. However, in situations where intrinsic motivation is already high, where someone is already passionately interested in doing something, fascinated by it, feeling personally challenged by it, if they are given a reward that they view as a bonus, not a constraint, but a bonus, then that can add to their creativity. If they're able to view extrinsic motivators as something that's nice on top of what they're already interested in doing, that won't undermine creativity. It won't undermine intrinsic motivation. Can I tell you about a couple of studies where we discovered this, one with children, one with adults?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it sounds fascinating.
Okay, so the study, these were actually a couple of studies that I did with my wonderful colleague, my longtime collaborator, Beth Hennessy at Wellesley College. These studies we call the immunization studies. We had this reasoning from kind of a biological analogy, and that we often like to use analogies to spark creative thinking. So that's what Beth and I did. We thought, okay, let's think about extrinsic motivators as a kind of germ or toxin, bacteria. Let's see if we could think about ways of motivating children or allowing them to maintain their intrinsic motivation by immunizing them or inoculating them against those potentially negative impacts of extrinsic motivators. So how does immunization work? Well, it works to overall strengthen the immune system. In our analogy, that would be to strengthen intrinsic motivation by making children more aware of their intrinsic motivation for doing something. And the other is that it introduces a small amount of the toxin in a way that's not likely to have an overwhelming effect, but just enough to allow the immune system to counteract it. So that's what we were going for in these studies. And what we did was to use videos, little video dramas that we created that we could show to children. I think these were 4th and 5th graders. So we had a boy actor and a girl actor from that age group, and we had them interacting with an adult. I was the adult in these videos. And I was talking to Tommy and Sarah, the pseudonyms we gave them. I was talking to Tommy and Sarah about learning in school. So I asked them questions like, Tommy and Sarah, tell me about the things that you most enjoy learning about in school. And one of them talked about enjoying doing projects and reports on people in different parts of the world, learning about their cultures and their customs, the kind of food that they ate, what kinds of things they did in their day. And Tommy was very excited about that kind of thing. He said, I really love learning about what goes on in the rest of the world. Sarah talked about astronomy. We're learning about the stars right now and the planets. And I love, taking my dad outside at night after it gets dark and showing him the different constellations I'm learning about and some of the planets that you can see when it's really dark. She said, that's really exciting to me. It's a whole lot of fun. And then the adult, me, said, that it sounds like you're both really excited about a lot of what you do in school. But what about your grades or getting rewards from your parents if you get a good report card? Do you ever think about that stuff? And so notice the first part of that got Tommy and Sarah talking about what they loved about learning. That was a part of strengthening the immune system, strengthening their awareness of their intrinsic motivation. The second part was getting them to think about rewards in a secondary way. So not as important as the intrinsic motivation of the joy of learning. So they both said something like, sure, I think about getting good grades. I want to get a good report card. And it's fun when my parents take me out for ice cream after I get a good report card. But that's never the most important thing to me. I really just love learning new stuff. So we had children, 4th and 5th graders, come into a separate classroom and in small groups watch this video, or randomly assigned, watch a control video where Tommy and Sarah were talking to me, answering questions that I asked them about their favorite foods and their favorite seasons of the year and why. So a neutral topic, but it was the same adult talking with the same 2 kids on the video about an irrelevant topic, irrelevant to motivation. So we had the kids in these 2 different the experimental condition and the control condition, watch the video with a different adult kind of supervising the showing of the video. And then that other adult, that other experimenter, ask the kids to talk about these things themselves. So what do you guys most like learning in school? Tell us what your most exciting topic is, your most exciting subject. That was helping the kids to use the modeling that they got from Tommy and Sarah to talk about their own intrinsic motivation, help these children strengthen their own awareness of what's motivating about learning. And then she asked them to talk about getting grades, good report cards, gold stars, that kind of thing, and help them to see that those aren't necessarily the most important things. And most of the kids did, in fact, echo what they had heard from Tommy and Sarah. And in the control group, the experimenter asked kids to talk about their favorite foods, their favorite seasons of the year, and exactly the topics that Tommy and Sarah had talked about in that control videotape. Importantly, we had these children fill out a short questionnaire a couple of weeks earlier, just administered by the teacher in their classroom, that was an assessment of their intrinsic motivation toward learning, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation toward learning. And that was a questionnaire that had been developed by Susan Harder in her research. After the experimental sessions with these small groups of kids, a couple of days later, a different experimenter came in and brought the kids into that experiment classroom where they often participated in studies, brought them in individually and put them into one of our typical creativity killing situations where, the control group, they were just asked to do an activity where we could assess their creativity. I think that in that particular study, it was to tell a story to a picture book that had no words in it, to look through the pictures and then to narrate a story about it. And then later we had these stories assessed on creativity by a different set of teachers in that age group. We found that the children who had been in the control condition, that is, who talked about their favorite seasons of the year and their favorite colors, those children showed the usual creativity killing effect. That is, if they were in the condition where they were asked to do this activity in order to get a reward, their creativity was lower than if they had just been brought into this experimental classroom and asked to do the activity. They were significantly lower in creativity. But if they had been in the experimental group earlier, if they had seen the videotape of Tommy and Sarah talking about what's exciting about learning and how, getting good grades and rewards from their parents are great, but not as important to them. They don't really think about those things when they're learning. They just really enjoy learning. And the children themselves had talked about those topics. If they had gone through that situation a couple of days earlier, they did not show the creativity killing effect. No matter what condition they were in, they showed higher levels of creativity. So we did, in fact, immunize these children against the negative effects, the potentially negative effects of reward on their creativity. In fact, those who were in the reward condition showed higher levels of creativity. So an exact reversal of this creativity killing effect, of this extrinsic motivator of reward, because they had learned to think about it in a different way. And then later on in the week, when they filled out the questionnaire again, the Susan Harder measure of intrinsic motivation toward learning, the kids who had been in our immunization condition actually showed higher levels of intrinsic motivation in their answers to that questionnaire. So that's an example, Keith, of a situation in which, conditions under which the extrinsic motivator of reward doesn't undermine creativity and can actually add to intrinsic motivation rather than cutting it down. So in a different study with adults, we had the adults come in and participate in an experiment on, I don't even remember what it was, but that was just a bogus setup because we wanted to come in and tell them, oh my gosh, the equipment isn't working. We're not going to be able to do the study that we had intended to have you come in and do. These adults were all students in an introductory psychology class. And as you know, Keith, often psychology students are given extra credit in their courses if they participate in a certain number of experiments that are being run in the psychology department. So that was the situation. And we gave them a choice. Half of them, we gave a choice as to whether they wanted to use the rest of the time. They had come in expecting that they were going to spend something like a half hour in the lab. And this technical glitch happened in the first 2 minutes. So if they were in the choice condition, we said, oh gosh, well, we're doing a different experiment in this lab. Would you like to participate in that? It involves making a collage with poster board and different colors and shapes of origami paper. It'll take about the same amount of time. Would you like to do that? That's experiment. So choice, no choice. And we had a second variable. So this was a 2x2 design. The other variable was whether they were going to get a reward, a monetary reward for being in that second study, which was, of course, the real study that we were interested in. Half of them were told, in this other study, we're giving people $2 or $5. I don't remember what it was, but you'll get that money at the end if they were in the no choice condition. So no choice condition, they were just told, oh, we can't do that experiment. We'll do this other one. And you'll get out of here in the same amount of time. And you'll get your credits for Psych 1, but you will also get the money that we're paying people in that other experiment. Okay? An unexpected bonus, right?
Right.
The people who were making a choice were told, well, we have this other experiment. Would you want to do it? And we described the experiment. Would you want to make a collage in order to get these $5? Okay? You'll get your credit, but you'll also get $5 if you agree to do this other experiment. That was the chosen reward condition, where they heard themselves saying, and everybody agreed. I mean, in both conditions, people said, sure, fine, I'll do that other experiment if they had a choice. But in that reward choice condition, they were agreeing to do this creative task in order to get that money. We expected that this would induce an extrinsic motivational state in them, and it did. We expected that it would lead to lower levels of creativity than in the control conditions, and it did. However, and we expected that people who had no choice and got the money would be about the same level as the no choice, no reward condition, the kind of baseline condition. But to our surprise, people who got the money without being given a choice had the highest levels of creativity of any condition in the experiment. We did not expect that. And to us, that showed that, yeah, if it's presented as a bonus beyond just the whatever fun you have in doing this activity, then it doesn't necessarily undermine intrinsic motivation and creativity. In fact, that extrinsic motivator can add on top of the intrinsic motivation and lead to higher levels of creativity.
Well, they're both two fascinating experiences, and I have so many questions. And the first one is, you've been talking about intrinsic motivation and making a very close connection with creativity. And I think of intrinsic motivation as being this state of mind where you're doing something just because you love doing it. You're really enjoying it. You mentioned learning for the students. They just really enjoy learning just for the sake of learning. Or, in my case, I play piano and I just go practice piano 30 minutes every day just because I enjoy doing it, not because, my parents are making me do it or because I have a performance coming up.
Keith, I think I heard you play piano once at a conference. Is that right? I have this memory of it.
I think so. Yeah, it would have been a long time ago. And,
it was really fun. You're pretty good.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and I'm still playing. But my question is about intrinsic motivation and creativity. So, could you say a little bit about that link? It sounds like you're saying that if you are intrinsically motivated, then you are going to be more creative. Did I hear that right?
Yes. Yeah.
All
In
right. So,
fact, the more intrinsically motivated people are, the more creative they will be. I wouldn't say that intrinsic motivation necessarily feels like fun or enjoyment. I had the pleasure of interviewing the novelist John Irving many years ago about his creative process and about his childhood experiences. I was at that point trying to really understand childhood creativity and how it develops. And he told me something very interesting about his current process as a novelist. I don't know if you're familiar with his books. He wrote, I think his big first breakout novel was The World According to Garp. He
right.
wrote Cider House Rules, both of which were made into movies, I believe, many years ago. He told me that because he has dyslexia, it's hard for him to actually work with the language to type. And he said that, moreover, he is so intent on creating fascinating characters and fascinating situations that somehow hang together that it's very hard work for him. He said he said something like, it's all about love. The reason I can work so hard at my writing is that it's not work for me. And then he explained that he is working so hard sometimes that he perspires. It feels difficult. It doesn't necessarily feel fun, but he can't not do it. He feels compelled to do this thing that is so deeply engaging to him and that he feels is using his skills at their highest level. So it doesn't necessarily feel fun. I think fundamentally, the reason that intrinsic motivation supports creativity and is in fact necessary for creativity is that when people are in an primarily intrinsically motivated state, they're much more likely to explore for new solutions, for new ideas. I like to use a maze analogy. So you think of a problem you have to solve as a maze that you need to get through. Or maybe the problem that you're trying to solve is how to write this chapter of your novel. Maybe the problem you're trying to solve is how to next work on this painting that you're working on, or how to solve a mathematical puzzle. Think of it as a maze that you need to get through. And maybe there's one completely straight pathway out of that maze. That's the ordinary way to solve it. The kind of no-brainer solution, the phoning it in way to do it. But there could very well be other exits from that maze, but they require some exploration. They require trying out different pathways, some of which will be dead ends, will not give you something that you consider workable, but some of which will lead to much more creative solutions. Think of that straight path as leading directly to a nice, juicy reward at the end. If that reward is there, you're primarily extrinsically motivated. Your eye is on that reward. You're going to take the straight pathway out of it, most likely, because that is primary in your mind. That shiny object at the end is going to get you to just get through it as quickly and cleanly in as straightforward a way as you can. But if you're intrinsically motivated, you enjoy exploring the maze. You enjoy the process of engaging in that activity. And you're much more likely, therefore, to discover one of those more creative solutions, one of those more creative exits from the maze. Does that make sense, Keith?
Right. More surprising, more unexpected, something that no one else has done before. It's that kind of problem discovery or iterative, wandering, exploratory kind of mindset or practice.
I think that's a good way to think of it. Yeah.
So I'm thinking about John Irving and the kids in school or the ones in the story. It seems pretty different though, because if you're a novelist and you love writing novels and you write novels all day long because you get in this peak flow state from writing novels, what's the connection with, I don't know, an eighth grade student who has to go to school every day and has to sit there and learn? Uh, do you mean that they have the same kind of intrinsic motivation for learning? It seems like a big expectation to expect an eighth grader to love learning as much as John Irving loves writing novels.
I don't know that I will accept that, Keith. I think that at fundamentally, the most basic level, it is the same kind of thing. I happen to have an eighth grader in my family. It's my granddaughter, and she goes to a wonderful school where children are given enough of the conditions that support creativity, one of which is freedom in choosing, for example, topics that they will do research on, that they will write about, that they will draw pictures about, whatever. They're given enough freedom that they can really dig into something that fascinates them. And she does a lot. And I know that others of her classmates do as well. It may be very different in degree compared to John Irving's, what you call the flow state of getting really deeply into the work he's doing. But I don't think it's fair to assume it's different in kind.
Right. And that same connection between the state and being more creative, I guess. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And you know, this state of intrinsic motivation, I think, can lead people to persevere through difficult patches in something that they're doing. You know, beyond the simple little activities that I gave people in those experiments that I ran decades ago. When you're talking about someone who's working on something for weeks, maybe if it's a eighth grade project, or months, years, if it's a novel, there are going to be failures. There are going to be difficulties. There are going to be times when you're running into one of those dead ends in the maze, and maybe that happens a lot. But if you're intrinsically motivated, you remain pulled toward the possibility of new learning, new insight, new discovery, new creation. And that can get you through a lot of what feel like failures. And John Irving when I interviewed him, this was many years ago, many people were working on computers to do their writing. Most novelists, I would say, were using computers. He loved his typewriter, and he still sat at his typewriter every day. And he said, it's not at all uncommon for me to just rip up a bunch of pages, sometimes a whole day's work. And that would be, for him, several hours. And yeah, those days are frustrating, and it's hard to have a day like that. But there's always the excitement of working your way through whatever knotty problem you've got yourself into with this plot or this character, and breaking through to the other side. John Irving talked about what he did as craftsmanship more than inspiration from the gods. He said, I feel like I'm building an interesting and beautiful building. And I have to use my best craftsmanship in it at every stage, from the tiniest details up to the overall structure. That's hard work, and it does involve a lot of setbacks, but that strong intrinsic motivation can keep you going.
Yeah, I feel like we're getting to like the workplace or the job. So we talk about these kids going to school all day long and needing that intrinsic motivation to be learning effectively. And then we go all the way over to a novelist who I can understand why someone who chooses to be a novelist would really love writing all day long. And then all of us, the adults in the world who do have to go to the workplace and work all day long. And I don't know, it seems to me like intrinsic motivation, I'd much rather feel intrinsically motivated in the workplace. And now you're saying if I am, I'll be more creative. And that's something employers want. So it seems like everybody wins if the employees are intrinsically motivated.
That's right. Unfortunately, like many classrooms in most school systems, many workplaces have way too many extrinsic motivators and extrinsic constraints
Yes.
on work, and not nearly enough of the intrinsic motivators. I began studying creativity in the workplace in the early 80s by wondering if the kinds of things that I had studied in the laboratory were actually important factors, like, reward, evaluation, competition, those various extrinsic motivators that I found could be so deadly to creativity in my little controlled experiments. Do they make a difference when people are trying to be creative for a living? So I began doing a series of interview studies with colleagues, primarily Stanley Griskevich at the Center for Creative Leadership in Greensboro, North Carolina. We began interviewing R&D scientists. That to me, that was a group who, were there working to get a paycheck, but were also required to do creative work. They were supposed to discover the company's new products, the company's new processes. And the protocol that I invented for this set of interviews was to simply ask people to think in advance about an example of high creativity from their recent work experience the last year or two, and an example of low creativity from their recent work experience. And I asked them for both stories to think about a project they were doing or problem they were working on that did require creativity in order to be done well. And in one case, it happened. And in the other case, for whatever reason, it just didn't happen. The result was uncreative, or it just never got done. And just ask them to describe what happened in as much detail as you can, who was involved, describe anything that you can about the team, the work environment, management of that project, or whatever else. We just let them talk. It was open-ended. And then we coded those interviews to look not only at personal factors, but our keenest interest was on work environment factors. And we discovered a set of what we called obstacles to creativity. And they did include the kinds of things that I had studied in the lab, but they included other things that I don't think it would have been possible or not straightforward to study in the lab. Things like a lack of any way to implement new ideas in the organization, or a lack of a clear mechanism for implementing new ideas in the organization, or at least for this particular project in this part of the organization. I don't know how we could have studied that in the lab, but that showed up as a big one. A lack of encouragement at the highest levels of the organization to be creative, to be innovative, which at that time was a real problem in many of the organizations that we studied. We also found a group of creativity stimulants, factors in the work environment that seem to lead to these highly creative outcomes. And that was something that I hadn't studied in the lab. We studied that freedom or a sense of autonomy in being able to actually go in and figure out the details of what you're going to do, how you're going to do it. That was important in supporting these creative outcomes. We found that having a team environment where there's a lot of diversity of perspectives, but an openness to these different perspectives was crucial. We found that having project management where the project manager was a model of a good work ethic, valued individual contributions to the project, facilitated communication in the team, set up an atmosphere where people could bring forward problems and mistakes without being castigated. That cluster of team leader behaviors we found was a crucial stimulant to creativity. And there were many other stimulants to creativity at both the team level and the organizational level in setting up a good work environment for creativity. And that research led to the development of a questionnaire, an instrument that we call KEYS, that assesses the work environment for creativity, both the stimulants and the obstacles in a work environment. And research that I did with a research team I put together found that project work environments, while the project was going on, that according to our KEYS instrument, had a lot of the creativity stimulants and fewer of the creativity obstacles. Those project work environments led to projects that were independently rated later as more creative by experts within the organization than projects where the creativity obstacles dominated the work environment.
Right. So now we're talking about social context, that the social context, all these factors, and this is what I think is fascinating about your research, is that you've drilled down and you have very specific understandings of here are the obstacles and here are the social contexts that can enhance, I guess it's both your intrinsic motivation and your creativity. So social context doesn't have to be someone holding you back or, I guess, I don't know, limiting. I think of that notion of constraints or rules or guidelines, the workplace. Your boss is always saying, don't do this, don't do that. Here's all these policies you have to follow. But now you're saying that there are ways, if I guess in this case, if you're the manager or the leader, but what if you're the employee and let's say me, or I'm very intrinsically motivated, but let's say someone listening and they're not feeling so intrinsically motivated. Are there things they can do to enjoy their work more, to enhance their creativity, or is it all about the social context? Do you just have to leave and go to a different company? I guess you can always do that.
That's what I was wondering, Keith, when I set out to look even more microscopically. You said, oh, so you got inside an organization, you looked at what was going on. I wanted to become even more microscopic a few years ago. And what I did with a large team of researchers and with one primary colleague, Stephen Kramer, was to do a diary study where we asked people inside organizations working on creative projects. And again, those were projects where creativity, novelty was necessary for the project to be successful. We went in and studied people from the beginning of these projects to the end of the projects by asking them to fill out a short electronic diary toward the end of every single workday. We managed to get a really good response rate. I don't know if we could do that today with everything coming at people electronically, but we got a very good response rate. And we discovered that, yes, work environments that were marked by the stimulants to creativity were more likely to lead to individual and team creativity. But we also found that there were, in a few instances, an organizational work environment that was not conducive to creativity, where there were a lot of constraints, which to us as outsiders appeared to be completely unnecessary constraints on people's behavior, and where people were not valued as individuals or as teams in many of the behaviors that came from top management in that organization. But we found that there were ways in which teams themselves could support each other's intrinsic motivation. I think it's very hard for one individual who wants to be intrinsically motivated in their work, who wants to be creative in their work, to do it alone. But most of us do work in teams, in organizations now. And if you can find even one colleague, or, ideally your project manager, but even just one colleague on your team with whom you can share about what aspects of the work are most exciting to you, where you feel you're providing the most value to the customer, whether it's an internal customer or an external customer, what it is you enjoy most about doing this work, and try to egg each other on intrinsically. That can help a lot. And we found instances where people were able to do this with a colleague. We found a team where the project managers were able to protect the members of their team to a large extent from an extremely hostile organizational work environment by creating a positive work environment within that team where there was a good degree of autonomy, not necessarily in what work you were going to do. Strategically, managers do need to set an overall strategic direction. Here's the goal we're trying to reach. But people were given as much autonomy as possible in how to do their work and how to reach their goal. They were able to use their own skills, their knowledge, their expertise, and their creative thinking skills to figure out how to solve the problems they had to solve most effectively. There was a lot of interpersonal nurturance of each other in that team, a lot of encouragement from the project leaders and from colleagues in the team. That can make a huge difference, we discovered. And these results are published in our book, The Progress Principle.
Right. Yeah, I can see the link between autonomy and intrinsic motivation, because if you don't have the ability to choose what you're going to do or which path you're going to take, then, yeah, I don't know how you could find that intrinsically motivating. So autonomy, choice, you need to have that kind.
Yes, and I want to mention one other thing. The reason we call the book The Progress Principle is that we discovered if people can have a sense of progress in the work that they're doing, even if the progress is kind of baby steps forward, incremental progress, what we call small wins, that can be incredibly motivating. That in itself can help maintain intrinsic motivation, even in the face of setbacks, even in the face of a difficult work environment. That sense of progress can lead people to be happier, to feel more intrinsically motivated in their work, to have more positive perceptions about the work they're doing, their team, themselves. And that can lead to further creativity, further productivity, which will then lead to more progress in the work. So we think it's super important for managers at all levels to look at how they can support people in making progress in their work every day. Do they have the resources they need? Do they have the information they need? Do they have the time that they need? As well as the freedom that they need? Do they have a clarity of the goals that they're reaching toward? Those are the progress supports that can be so important to day intrinsic motivation and creativity in the workplace.
Right. Yes, your book, The Progress Principle, it really is just a massive amount of work with these interviews. And I think, what was it in the book, 12,000 or more different?
12,000, almost 12,000 daily diary entries that we analyzed. These were fascinating stories that people told us about their days. And we had quantitative measures on those daily diaries as well, which helped us make some really keen discoveries.
And these were people who were engaged in, well, I think knowledge work. So I guess people like us with college degrees. And they were people who were working on a project. And you said the average duration of the project was 4 months. So when you talk about progress, I can see if you're in a 4-month trajectory or a 6-month trajectory, then you need to be progressing toward that goal. So what would be the opposite of that? Would you just get stuck where you're just not moving toward that goal that your team needs to get to? Yeah, that seems pretty
the opposite
obviously
of that,
not
the opposite of
motivating.
that is that the opposite is that your setbacks
Step back.
outnumber your progress events. And we found, even small setbacks can be really undermining of intrinsic motivation and creativity. You're going to have setbacks. You always are if you're doing creative, complex work. That goes with the territory. But what's important is for managers to make sure that they are supporting progress and nurturing that inner work life, encouraging people so that even in the face of setbacks, they can still make at least incremental progress, at least some forward movement in the work.
Yeah, it's interesting that when I was reading the book to prepare for this interview, I read it again. And at the end, you say your advice for all of us is that we should be journaling, that we should write notes about what we do at the end of every day. It's kind of a parallel to what you had these people do in your experiment. But so say a little bit about that. How can I take advantage of that advice? What should I do at the end of every day, that journaling sort of activity?
I would suggest keeping a progress journal, even if it's just 1 or 2 sentences at the end of your workday or at the end of your day, to note some progress that you made that day on something that was meaningful to you, even if it was just a small step forward. That will allow you to at least momentarily recognize that even in a day filled with frustration, perhaps, you were able to move forward on something. And you can just spend a few seconds celebrating that. And then if it was a day that was marked by a lot of setbacks, try to figure out what led to those setbacks. Were there obstacles that you might be able to change, that you might be able to overcome? And see if you can work on those the next day, just one of those obstacles, and see if you can somehow reduce it. If it was distractions, for example, how might you be able to at least carve out some time where you can protect yourself from distractions to make some progress on that most important work that you're trying to get done that next day? I started keeping a progress journal myself just before the book was published, because I thought, hey, we're recommending this to people based on the fact that many of the 238 people who sent us those daily diaries in our study, many of them at the end of our study of their team, many of them asked us if we could keep sending them the diary forms because they found them really helpful. I said, I should try this myself. And I have been keeping a progress journal ever since. And I feel that it really has supported my intrinsic motivation, my progress, and my creativity.
I do it at the end of every month. And then always in January, I go back to my 12 months of the prior year. And I found it very, I don't know, affirming, or at least you lose track of all the stuff that you get done. And you get into this mindset where you only notice what you didn't get done and what you still have to do. So just consciously being aware of those things. In your journal, though, for these people in your research study, they also would write about the obstacles, right? They would write
Yeah.
about the bad things, or would they only write about the good things?
No, we asked them quite an open-ended question. We said, briefly describe one event from today that stands out in your mind. It can be anything at all, as long as it's relevant to this project or your work on this project or your team's work on this project. Very open-ended. And when we trained them in how to write a good concrete diary entry every day, we told them it could even be something from your personal life if you
Uh,
feel it was somehow relevant to your work that particular day. But just tell us in as much detail as you can what happened, who was involved. And then we asked some questions about the event after that, including what impact do you think this event had on your work today? What impact, if any, did it have on your team's work? And how did it make you feel? So, yes, we got a lot of reports of negative events, setback events, obstacles that they encountered, as well as reports of progress. And of course, some days had reports of both.
right, right. Before we get to the end, I wanted to ask you about your latest book, which is about retirement. And when I first heard you're doing a book about retirement, I thought it seems like a really big switch because you have this many decades career as a creativity researcher. Is there a link between your decades of research into creativity and progress and then this new book? What did you find out about retirement and creativity?
So there were two motivations for me in doing a study on the retirement transition. One, of course, was a personal motivation. Look at, you can see my gray hair, my age and stage in life. But the other motivation was the discovery that of all the positive events that can happen in a person's workday that can lead to positive emotions and strong intrinsic motivation, the single most important is making progress in the work, as long as the work is meaningful. So progress in meaningful work, super important for intrinsic motivation and creativity. I began to wonder, well, what happens when meaningful work comes to an end? Yeah, I mean, you and I, Keith, as well as many professionals, are fortunate enough to have meaningful work. What happens when it goes away at the end of a career? Academics like us, we can continue to write books if we want. We can continue to do some research, but most people can't. I mean, if you're a brain surgeon, you're not going to continue, doing brain surgery in your garage. At least I hope you're not afterwards. So what happens? How do people deal with it? So a different group of colleagues and I set out to examine that question, and we did 215 interviews with professionals at various career stages, including people who had already retired when we interviewed them, a lot of people who were still working, but age 55 plus, and we even interviewed some millennials in this study about work, about career, about life, and of course, about retirement. Their attitudes about it, their decision making about it, and their experiences of retirement if they were going through the retirement transition or had retired already. Of the 120 people we interviewed, 14 of them were just about to retire when we started our study, when we recruited in their company. And we asked those people, gee, would you let us follow you with repeated interviews for a few years as you finish your career and go through the retirement transition and live your first few years in retirement? Fortunately, 14 people agreed to that, and over 100 of the interviews that we have came from those 14 people that we call our stars. So I feel like we got a lot of insight into what that retirement experience is like and how people can navigate it successfully. we discovered that there's a lot of fear and dread even about retirement, even among professionals, older professionals still working, who are financially secure and physically healthy. There's still a lot of uncertainty and dread about it. And we discovered that there are ways of navigating that transition better. We also discovered that there are things that organizations can do to help people through that retirement transition, to help people stop dreading the retirement transition. And one of the things that we discovered, which was to me maybe our most surprising discovery, to the extent that people have work assignments calling for creativity in the final years of their career, and to the extent that they're able to actually be creative toward the end of their career, they're likely to be happier, more satisfied in their retirement life.
Right. So let's say in my case, I should write a book just before I retire, or do a new research study. Well, what about in your case? Obviously, you're here doing a podcast interview, so that counts as work for a thought leader like you, and you just published a book not that long ago. So you're able to continue. I guess I should ask you that. Do you feel intrinsically motivated? Do you feel like in your career you've had that blessed career where you just loved what you do? That's my sense of you.
It is true. I feel very blessed to have had a career where I was able to have a lot of autonomy in what I did research on. And as you know, for many years, it was on creativity. And for many other years, it's been really delving more deeply into the experience of people at work, including what is it that leads people to be more creative day by day, and then people's day by day experience of retiring and what that's like. I I feel that I am still excited by this work. Um, that's wonderful, but I'm also happy to not be doing a lot of what I was doing at the peak of my career. I love teaching, for example. I even love many aspects of the administrative work that I did, but it feels like it's the right time to be done with that and to be talking about, yes, my latest research, but to be focusing on other things in my life as well.
Well, as we're wrapping up, I always like to ask if you could give us some practical advice, something maybe specific that a listener could do in the next week, something that might enhance your creativity in some way.
One of my favorite techniques is something that I learned many years ago that Ernest Hemingway, the writer Ernest Hemingway, used to do. And I think it can be applied to things, to creative activities that aren't writing, even. If you're engaged in something that requires creativity that you know you can't finish today, leave off. Stop working on it today at a point where you're pretty confident you know what the next step is going to be. So if you're writing a short story, writing a novel, if you're writing a condolence letter to someone, which is something that I often do, leave off at a point where you are confident you know how to finish that sentence, how to finish that paragraph. Because the next day, or then when you get back to it next, it's going to be that much easier for you to get into the flow of working on it creatively without feeling like there's a huge hurdle to get over. I think this could be even used with a physical project if you're trying to put something together or make something that's physical. If you leave off at a point where you know what your next step is going to be, or you're confident about where you want to go next, it can ease you into it the next day. And you might have the benefit of that overnight incubation, which can happen, so that, yeah, you know where you're going to pick up the next day, but you might have an even better way of finishing that sentence or finishing that paragraph or finishing that craft that you're making.
Thank you. I think that's great advice. And Teresa, I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for being on the Science of Creativity.
You're very welcome, Keith. I truly enjoyed our conversation.
That really was an incredible interview with Teresa Amabile. She's a professor at Harvard Business School, and she's been there a very long time. She's been doing creativity research since the 1970s and 1980s. And when I was in graduate school in the 1990s, we were reading her books in my classes. And here's one of the ones that I had back in the early 1990s. And I didn't have time to show her this in the interview, but you can see I've highlighted and I've written stuff in the margins. So she really is a star in creativity research, and it's a real honor to have her on my podcast, The Science of Creativity. And thank you so much for watching this interview. If you enjoyed it, I hope you'll subscribe, follow the show, leave a comment, share it with someone you know who is interested in creativity. And thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity.